In this video, we will discuss an essay by Northrop Frye titled Archetypes of Literature. Before moving into the essay, here is a short introduction to Northrop Frye. His full name is Herman Northrop Frye. He was a Canadian literary critic and theorist. His important works include Fearful Symmetry, Anatomy of Criticism, and Fables of Identity. Now, Northrop Frye coined the term garrison mentality. Now, this is not a term that is associated with this particular essay, but still, when we deal with the Canadian literature, it is an important term that we will come across. Frye also popularized archetypal criticism, which is the core idea in this essay. Archetypes of Literature, the essay that we will soon discuss, is a precursor essay to Frye's book Anatomy of Criticism. That is, Anatomy of Criticism, as we told earlier, is a very important book published by Frye. But before publishing this, he published his ideas in a very small, diluted way through his essay Archetypes of Literature. So, in Archetypes of Literature, he gave his basic theory in a general manner, and then the theory was developed and published in Anatomy of Criticism. Now, Northrop Frye is not the first person to write a book on archetypal criticism. The first work on archetypal criticism is Archetypal Patterns in Poetry by Mount Bodkin. But it was when Frye wrote this essay that archetypal criticism was popularized. This is why Frye's essay is important. Let's move into the essay. Now, this essay basically tells us what an archetype is and what archetypal criticism means. He begins by explaining the concept of archetypal criticism. To understand that, we should know what an archetype is. The word archetype is derived from two Greek words. One is arche, which means beginning, and typos, which means model. So, arche and typos together they mean the beginning model. Archetype, thus, is a beginning model or pattern that recurrently occurs in narrative designs, actions, character types, themes, and images. We will discuss it with an example so it will be easier for you. Now, we know Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet as the everlasting, eternal love story. You might have come across many movies and books which seem very similar to this work. Sometimes the characters are very similar to Romeo or Juliet, and sometimes the storyline has many similarities. So, the work Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare is like a beginning model that has been repeatedly, recurrently used in literature over all these years. This is what we call archetypes. Now, when we talk about archetypes, the origin of these archetypes go back to very ancient times. So, an archetype is a beginning model or pattern which recurrently occurs, repeatedly occurs in narrative designs, actions, character types, themes, and images, and it is identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature, myths, or even dreams. Let us look at some examples for archetypes. If you look at literature, you will find that some characters like the hero, wise man, or star-crossed lovers are repeatedly used. You will find them a lot. So these are archetypes. And themes like quest, death or rebirth, these are also very frequently used. Symbols like water, light, desert. Colors like red, green and black. Frye specially mentions the quest myth in which the hero or the protagonist of the story has to go in search of a truth or something else. For example, the myth of the Fisher King. The myth of the Fisher King is not necessary for you to study this essay. But if you are interested to know, you can read it in the comment section. I hope the idea of an archetype is clear to you, and based on that we have archetypal criticism. Archetypal criticism is a critical theory that interprets a text, analyzes a text by focusing on recurring myths and archetypes in narratives, symbols, images, and character types in literary works to find meaning. So, what is given importance when a work is analyzed by using archetypal criticism is the myth and archetypes in the work. These critics believed that any given story, whatever genre it belongs to, could be reduced to a specific archetypal core. This is the true meaning of a work. Now, archetypal criticism is a synthesis of structural criticism and historical criticism. That is, we know we use the myth and archetypes in the text when we are using archetypal criticism. So, we are basically focusing on the structure of the work to know what are the recurrent myths and archetypes that can be found. So, a structural analysis is taking place. But in order to know what are the recurrent myths, where are these myths used recurrently, we should also refer to other texts. This is where a tint of historical criticism comes. Thus, we can say archetypal criticism combines both structural criticism and historical criticism. Some archetypal critics are Robert Graves, Wilson Knight, and Joseph Campbell. According to Frye, the focus of a critic should be on the text, not on the writer. Frye is of the opinion that an author cannot intrude into his text and express his personal emotions and comments. He should maintain absolute objectivity. The writer is only a human medium, so the critic should not divert from the work and focus on the author. Sometimes there may be peculiar symbols that the writer used unconsciously, but criticism should not be just the biography of the writer. So here an archetypal critic is focusing on the structure of a work. Earlier we talked about how archetypal criticism combines both structural approach and historical approach. So this part of the essay tells us how the archetypal critic should focus on the structure. So Frye gave importance to the structural analysis of a work, that is the centripetal analysis, not the historical importance or the biography of the writer. He studied forms that the writer used to represent a subject matter. This is similar to how new critics evaluated the text, isn't it? Because new critics evaluated the text based on its structure. They did not go for the biography of the writer or the historical importance. They believed that every text is complete in itself. The meaning is there in the text itself. So Frye's archetypal criticism is quite similar to how new critics analyze the text, but it is not exactly the same. Because we already saw the historical approach is also a part of the archetypal criticism. Even though we are not giving importance to the biography of the writer or the historical background, we have to study other texts to understand a particular text. Unlike new critics, Frye believes that literary work should not be studied in isolation of other works. They are all part of a whole. His analysis is not limited to a single text. Individual work should be studied in terms of what it shares with other works. This is where Frye's idea is different from that of new critics. Let's go through two approaches by which we can study a text according to Frye. One is the inductive approach and the other is deductive approach. In the inductive approach, the critic uses particular truths in the work to produce a general truth. For example, in Shakespeare's work The Othello, we understand that Othello's jealousy put him in so much pain. Now that is the particular truth, that jealousy put Othello in pain. Now from this we understand that jealousy is always destructive, whether it is in the case of a story or real life situation. So this is the general truth that we derived from that. This is the inductive approach where we go from the particular to the general. There is also another approach known as the deductive approach, where we establish the meaning of a work from general truth to the particular truth. Among these two, Northrop Frye used the inductive approach. So, what would be the goal of literary criticism? According to Frye, a critic should use inductive method to find the archetypal form that the author merely recreated. That is, understanding the narrative structure and thereby understanding the archetypal form. The next important idea that Frye discusses in this essay is that myths are created from natural patterns. If you look at nature, everything in nature has a pattern. From seasons to water cycle to day and night, everything comes at regular intervals. It has a kind of pattern in it. Some aspects of these changes are understandable to us because we have scientific reasons to support these. But in the earlier times, these patterns were totally incomprehensible to man. We were trying to make some sense out of these patterns of nature. Thus, there was an attempt from our side to humanize natural phenomenon through rituals. And slowly, from natural cycles, myths, human rituals, harvest songs, sacrifices, and folk customs were created. And these reflected the rhythm of nature. One example would be the myth of death and rebirth. And it is from these myths that genres were formed. Myths can be categorized into two groups, comic and tragic, and these are again divided into comedy, romance, tragedy, and satire. Each of these genres is aligned with a season, comedy with spring, romance with summer, tragedy with autumn, and satire with winter. Frye also gives an explanation to why each of these seasons are connected to the genres. The relation between comedy and spring can be explained as just as how spring symbolizes defeat of winter and darkness, in comedy there is revival and resurrection. There is the birth of the hero. Autumn is the dying stage in seasonal calendar. Just as autumn represents demise, tragedy shows the downfall of the protagonist. Just as how winter lacks productivity, satire is also dark and lacks productivity. Its main function is to criticize. Also, as summer is the culmination of life in seasonal calendar, romance ends with triumph and marriage. Northrop Frye studied archetypes and he realized that all archetypes fall into these five categories. Thus, he made five spheres of archetypes, and they are the human world, animal world, vegetation, mineral, and water. The archetypes in each of these spheres falls into either the comic vision or the tragic vision. The human world in the comic vision contains archetypes like community, friendship, and love, whereas in the tragic vision it contains tyranny, isolation, and betrayal. The comic vision in the animal world includes gentle, pastoral, or domesticated animals, whereas in the tragic vision it includes wild animals, predatory animals, or beasts. In vegetation, gardens and parks are included in the comic vision, whereas wild forests and barren lands are included in the tragic vision. Comic vision in mineral sphere includes precious stones, temples, and cities, whereas the tragic vision includes deserts, ruins, and rocks. Similarly, in water, comic vision includes lakes and rivers, whereas flood and seas are included in the tragic vision. Frye also notes that every archetype cannot fall into one of these categories. There are also some exceptions. Neutral archetypes fall into this exception. Neutral archetypes cannot be categorized into tragic or comedic. For example, the island in Tempest, Prospero's island in Tempest, is an example of neutral archetype. These are the major points that Frye discusses in his essay, The Archetypes of Literature. A major drawback of this criticism is that It is of little importance to materialist critics like Marxist, feminist, and post colonial critics. Because archetypal criticism is only focusing on the recurrent patterns or archetypes in a text, it doesn't focus on the representation of a particular section of the society. Thus, it couldn't point out the role played by class, gender, or race in the text.